Fewer than 2% of applicants for overnight industrial monitoring jobs in the late 20th century lasted longer than 6 months, and most left without filing formal complaints. This is the life story of a system of rules, written, posted, and enforced, in silence, that turned ordinary night shift work into something closer to controlled survival. It began with a problem that did not look dramatic on paper. Facilities that ran through the night factories, storage depots, research labs, security stations faced a drop in human reliability between roughly 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. Reaction times slowed, perception narrowed, and small mistakes multiplied into large ones. The parents of the rule system were not individuals, but pressures: industrial efficiency, liability law, and the growing understanding of circadian disruption. One lesser-known fact is that early occupational studies showed error rates on night shifts could increase by up to 30% compared to daytime operations. Even when workers reported feeling alert, the first versions of these rules were not ominous. They were checklists. Do not skip patrol intervals, confirm all alarms manually, log every anomaly, no matter how small. But as incidents accumulated, missed leaks, unlocked doors, misread gauges, those lists grew more specific. Another lesser known fact is that in several documented cases, facilities introduced redundant observation rules, requiring workers to recheck the same system from different physical angles, not because the system needed it, but because human perception did. Early drafts reveal a pattern: rules written after something went wrong. If a worker ignored a sound that turned out to be critical, a rule appeared about investigating sounds. If someone opened the door they should not have, a rule forbade opening doors under certain conditions. A lesser-known fact is that some safety protocols were directly traced to single incidents, meaning one worker's mistake could shape procedures across entire industries. Childhood of this system was uneven. Workers misunderstood the intent. Some saw the rules as overbearing, others as optional. Training often emphasized compliance without explanation, which created a gap between action and understanding. A lesser-known fact is that training programs for night shift roles historically received less funding than daytime operations, despite higher error risks, due to assumptions that routine work required less instruction. Early failures were predictable. Workers skipped steps to save time. Supervisors quietly ignored minor violations to keep morale stable. The system responded by tightening. Rules became more rigid, language more absolute. Do not replaced, should not. A lesser known fact is that linguistic analysis of safety manuals shows a measurable shift towards stricter modal verbs after periods of increased incident rates. Small changes mattered more than large ones. Adding a requirement to verbally confirm actions of N when alone reduced errors in some environments. Forcing workers to write instead of checkboxes increased attention. A lesser-known fact is that requiring handwritten logs rather than pre-printed checklists reduced false compliance by creating a cognitive pause. Growth came with scale. As industries expanded, so did the rule systems. Manuals thickened, procedures standardized. What had been local practices became institutional doctrine. A lesser-known fact is that by the early 2000s, some industrial safety manuals exceeded 1,000 pages. With night shift protocols accounting for a disproportionate share, logistics adapted around the rules. Facilities installed more sensors, more cameras, more alarms, not to replace workers, but to guide them. The rules began to reference the systems, and the systems reinforced the rules. A lesser-known fact is that in some facilities, alarm systems were intentionally designed to require human acknowledgement within a time window, not because the system needed confirmation, but to ensure the worker was still attentive. Standardization created predictability. Workers moved between sites and recognized familiar structures. patrol routes, logbooks, restricted areas. The rules became portable. A lesser-known fact is that multinational corporations often maintained identical night shift protocols across continents, despite different local risks, because consistency reduced training complexity. But growth also introduced friction. Workers reported fatigue not just from the work, but from the constant vigilance the rules demanded. Every action required confirmation. Every anomaly required documentation. A lesser-known fact is that cognitive load studies found that excessive, procedural steps could paradoxically increase error rates if they exceeded a worker's processing capacity during low alertness hours. At its peak, the system was both feared and respected. The ideal night shift worker followed the rules exactly, without deviation, without interpretation. In higher-risk environments, chemical plants, power stations, secure storage, the rules were credited with preventing disasters. A lesser fact is that post-incident analyses often found that near misses were avoided not by advanced technology, but by strict adherence to seemingly minor procedural rules. There are defining scenarios. A worker hears a noise in a restricted area. The rule says do not investigate alone. Another rule says do not ignore anomalies. The system resolves the conflict. Report, wait, verify with support. It works because it removes improvisation. A lesser-known fact is that rule hierarchies, where one rule overrides another, were introduced specifically to handle such conflicts. Reducing hesitation under pressure, the effectiveness came from narrowing choices. In uncertain conditions, fewer options meant fewer errors. The rules turned ambiguity into sequence. A lesser-known fact is that decision-making models used in safety engineering deliberately reduced branching paths during higher-risk periods, especially at night. But the cost was human. Fatigue accumulated. The constant need to follow precise steps under low alertness conditions wore people down. Some workers described a sense of detachment, as if they were executing a script rather than thinking. A lesser-known fact is that long-term night shift workers show measurable changes in sleep architecture, including reduced REM sleep, which affects emotional regulation. Fear was subtle but present. Not fear of the environment, but fear of making a mistake within the system. A missed log entry, a skipped check, a delayed response each carried consequences. A lesser-known fact is that disciplinary actions for procedural violations often outnumbered those for actual incidents, reflecting the system's emphasis on prevention over outcome. Injury patterns reflected the environment. More minor injuries occurred during night shifts. Slips, misjudgments, often linked to reduced attention. A lesser-known fact is that lighting conditions, even when meeting standards, still contributed to depth perception errors during overnight hours. Psychological effects accumulated. Isolation, monotony, and the weight of responsibility created strain. Some workers adapted, others left. A lesser-known fact is that turnover rates for night shift positions in certain industries exceeded 50% annually, driven more by psychological fatigue than physical demands. Old age of the system did not come suddenly. It came through competition. Automation improved. Sensors became more reliable. Artificial monitoring systems reduced the need for constant human checking. The rules began to shift from action to supervision. A lesser-known fact is that in highly automated facilities, human roles transitioned to exception handling, meaning workers intervened only when systems flagged anomalies. New tactics emerged. Instead of forcing humans to maintain constant vigilance, systems were designed to alert only when needed. The burden shifted from continuous attention to rapid response. A lesser-known fact is that alarm fatigues caused by too many alerts became a recognized issue, leading to redesigned notification systems that prioritize critical signals. Changing environments also played a role. Remote monitoring allowed centralized oversight. One worker could oversee multiple sites through screens rather than physical patrols. A lesser-known fact is that centralized control rooms reduce physical risks but introduce new cognitive challenges, including information overload. New doctrine replaced old rigidity with flexibility. Rules became guidelines supported by adaptive systems. Training emphasized understanding, not just compliance. A lesser-known fact is that modern safety programs incorporate human factors engineering, designing systems around human limitations rather than forcing humans to adapt to systems. Yet the legacy remains. Later designs copied the core idea: structure, behavior to reduce error under stress, checklists in aviation, protocols in medicine, procedures in cybersecurity reflect the same logic. A lesser-known fact is that the widespread adoption of checklists in surgery was influenced by industrial safety practices developed decades earlier. Militaries learned similar lessons. Night operations rely on clear, simple rules to reduce confusion. The principle is the same: limit choices, enforce sequence, reduce ambiguity. A lesser-known fact is that military night operation manuals often include simplified decision trees specifically for low-visibility conditions. What remains is not the exact wording of the rules, but the understanding behind them. Humans are not constant. Attention fades, perception shifts. Systems must account for that. A lesser-known fact is that modern research into circadian rhythms continues to refine work schedules, with some organizations rotating shifts forward in time to align better with natural sleep cycles. In the end, the system of rules did not live or die like a machine. It evolved, spread, adapted, and partially dissolved into other systems. Its life story is written in manuals, in training sessions, in quiet nights where nothing went wrong, because someone followed a step they did not fully understand. And the final line it leaves is simple: most disasters are not dramatic in their beginnings. They are small, human, and preventable. If someone, somewhere, follows the rule. At 3:17 a.m., in controlled workplace studies, visual misinterpretation events spiked by nearly 18%, even in well-lit environments, and most workers do not notice the error when it happens. That is where this system of rules continued its life, no longer just a list on a wall, but a structure shaping how a person moved, looked, and decided when the body itself was working against them. Expansion of the rule system did not come from ambition, but from accumulation. Every incident report added a sentence. Every near miss added a clause. Over time, the rules stopped being short instructions and became layered sequences, where one action depended on three others being completed. First, a lesser-known fact is that procedural layering was introduced after investigation showed that single-step rules were more likely to be skipped than multi-step sequences that forced engagement. What looked simple on paper became complex in practice. Check the perimeter turned into a defined route, a defined pace, a defined order, and a defined reporting format. Workers were no longer just moving through space, they were following a script written by past mistakes. A lesser-known fact is that route standardization reduced blind spots by up to 22% in some facilities, simply by removing personal variation. In patrol patterns, the environment itself began to adapt to the rules. Lights were positioned not just for visibility, but to guide movement. Doors were labeled not just for identification, but for behavioral control. Even silence became part of the system, as workers were trained to recognize when something sounded wrong rather than just loud. A lesser-known fact is that acoustic anomalous sounds that did not match expected patterns were responsible for early detection in several documented equipment failures. Growth also meant scale of consequence. A mistake at night could go unnoticed longer, which meant the rules had to assume delay. This led to redundancy, double checks, timestamps, overlapping responsibilities. A lesser-known fact is that timestamp logging was introduced primarily to reconstruct timelines after incidents, not to monitor performance in real time, but something else developed quietly alongside the system: interpretation. Workers began to read between the lines. A rule that seemed excessive often had a reason, even if it was not explained. Over time, experienced workers could sense which rules were critical and which were protective layers. A lesser-known fact is that informal knowledge, transfer workers explaining why to each other, often had more impact on compliance than formal training sessions. There were moments when the system revealed its limits. A worker hears a repeated tapping sound behind a secured panel. The rules say do not open restricted panels without authorization. Another rule says investigate persistent anomalies. The system cannot fully resolve the ambiguity, can only narrow it. A lesser-known fact is that conflict between rules was identified as a major source of hesitation, leading to the later introduction of escalation protocols rather than direct action. This is where doctrine began to shift. Instead of expecting perfect adherence in every situation, the system introduced hierarchy: observe, report, wait. It prioritized communication over action. A lesser-known fact is that communication delays, not action errors, were found to be the primary cause of escalation in several night shift incidents. Peak effectiveness came not from strictness alone, but from predictability. Workers knew exactly what to do, even when tired. The rules became a substitute for instinct when instinct was unreliable. In higher-risk environments, this predictability prevented small issues from becoming large ones. A lesser-known fact is that in facilities with strict procedural adherence, incident escalation rates dropped significantly even when minor errors still occurred. There is a defining type of night uneventful on the surface, but full of small decisions. A door is slightly ajar, a light flickers, a monitor shows a brief anomaly. Each is minor, but the rules treat them as signals. The worker logs, checks, reports. Nothing happens. That is the point. A lesser-known fact is that most successful safety systems measure effectiveness not by incidents prevented, but by anomalies detected and resolved early. Yet the human cost deepened. Repetition created fatigue of a different kind, not physical, but cognitive. Doing the same precise actions night after night required sustained attention that the human brain does not naturally maintain in low-stimulation environments. Fact is that monotony has been shown to reduce alertness more than moderate workload, especially during circadian low points. Sleep disruption followed workers home. Rotating schedules, irregular hours, and the mental residue of constant vigilance affected rest. Some adapted. Many did not. A lesser-known fact is that long-term night shift workers have higher rates of sleep disorders. Even when total sleep time appears sufficient, there was also a subtle psychological shift. Workers began to trust the rules more than their own judgment. This was intentional to a degree. The system was designed to override unreliable perception, but it came at a cost. When something truly unusual happened, hesitation could occur. A lesser-known fact is that over-reliance on procedure has been identified as a factor in delayed responses to novel situations. Injuries did not always come from dramatic failures. They came from small lapses. A misstep, a delayed reaction, a moment of inattention. The rules reduced risk, but they could not eliminate human variability. A lesser-known fact is that micro-Aristini deviations from procedure account for a large proportion of minor workplace injuries during night shifts. The beginning of decline was not visible at first. Technology improved quietly. Sensors became more accurate. Automated systems could detect anomalies faster than humans. The role of the worker began to shift from active monitoring to passive oversight. A lesser-known fact is that in some modern facilities, over 80% of routine checks are now performed by automated systems rather than humans. With automation came a change in the rules themselves. Instead of telling workers what to do constantly, The system told them when to act. Alerts replaced patrols. Dashboards replaced logbooks. The rhythm of the night changed from continuous movement to periods of waiting, interrupted by bursts of action. A lesser-known fact is that intermittent alert systems can improve response times, but also increase stress due to unpredictability. Centralization followed. One worker could monitor multiple systems from a single location. Physical presence became less important than situational awareness. A lesser-known fact is that centralized monitoring reduced staffing needs, but increased the cognitive demands on individual workers. Doctrine adapted again. Training shifted toward understanding systems rather than following steps. Workers were expected to interpret data, not just observe it. The rules became frameworks rather than scripts. A lesser-known fact is that modern training programs often include simulation, scenarios to prepare workers for rare but critical events. Despite these changes, the old system did not disappear completely. In high-risk environments, strict procedural rules remain. The reason is simple. When consequences are severe, predictability still matters more than flexibility. A lesser-known fact is that industries with low tolerance for error, such as nuclear energy, continue to rely heavily on procedural compliance, even with advanced automation. The legacy is layered. Some parts of the system evolved into modern practices. Others remain unchanged. The idea that human behavior can be structured to reduce risk has spread far beyond night shift work. A lesser-known fact is that many everyday safety practices like checklists and confirmation steps trace their origins to industrial rule systems developed decades ago. What this system ultimately revealed is not just how to manage risk, but how to manage people within risk. It acknowledged limits of attention, of perception, of endurance, and it built around them. Quiet hours still exist. Night shifts still happen. Somewhere, a worker is following a sequence of steps written by someone they will never meet, for a problem they may never see. And the system continues not as a list of rules, but as a way of thinking. Assume error, design against it, and trust. That structure can carry a person through the hours when instinct cannot. Somewhere between 2:43 a.m. and 4:12 a.m., the human brain enters what sleep researchers call a circadian trough, where alertness can drop by as much as 40% compared to daytime baseline, even in trained individuals. That is the hour this system learned to fear not because of what happens often, but because of what happens quietly, without witnesses. When attention fades and the rules must carry the weight alone, by this stage, the system had already spread across industries. But what changed now was its depth. It was no longer just external, posted on walls or printed in manuals, but internalized. Workers began to anticipate rules before reading them, to move in patterns shaped by repetition. A lesser-known fact is that behavioral conditioning and repetitive safety tasks can reduce conscious decision-making by up to 60%, effectively turning trained actions into automatic responses. Yet automatic behavior introduced a new vulnerability. When actions become routine, they can continue even when conditions change. A worker might follow a sequence perfectly, but fail to notice that the situation no longer fits the sequence. A lesser-known fact is that automation bias is not limited to machines. Humans can also default to habitual patterns, even when contradictory evidence is present. This is where the rule system began to incorporate interruption. It introduced moments designed to break routine mandatory pauses, verbal confirmations, cross-checks with another person. These were not for efficiency. They were for awareness. A lesser-known fact is that forced interruptions in procedural tasks have been shown to significantly reduce error rates during low alertness periods. Even though they slightly increased task completion time, the environment responded again. In some facilities, lighting levels were deliberately varied to prevent visual monotony. In others, ambient noise was controlled to avoid both silence and overload. The goal was not comfort, but stimulation within limits. A lesser-known fact is that completely silent environments can increase the likelihood of perceptual errors during night shifts. As the brain begins to fill gaps with assumed patterns, there were also experiments. Small, often undocumented, supervisors tried rotating tasks more frequently. They introduced brief physical movement requirements, not for productivity, but to maintain alertness. Some require workers to check in verbally at fixed intervals, even when nothing had changed. A lesser-known fact is that microactivity standing, walking short distances, can temporarily restore alertness more effectively than caffeine during circadian lows, but caffeine itself became part of the system, not officially, not written into rules, but present in practice. Workers learned when to use it, when to avoid it, how it affected their performance hours later. A lesser-known fact is that poorly timed caffeine intake can disrupt post-shift sleep, creating a cycle of fatigue that accumulates over days rather than hours. At this point in its life, the system was no longer reacting only to incidents, it was reacting to human limits with increasing precision. It began to incorporate data from psychology, physiology, and ergonomics. The rules became less about control and more about compensation. A lesser-known fact is that human factors engineering emerged as a formal discipline, partly from the need to design systems that account for predictable human error under conditions like night work. They were still defining nights, though not dramatic, not catastrophic, but instructive. A worker notices that a gauge reading is slightly outside its normal range, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss. The rules require logging any deviation. The deviation is logged, reviewed, and traced back to a slow leak that would have escalated hours later. Nothing happens, and that is the success. A lesser-known fact is that early anomaly detection accounts for a significant portion of prevented incidents. Even though it rarely receives recognition, but not all outcomes were controlled. There were nights when the rules were followed and something still went wrong. Systems failed in unexpected ways. Human interpretation, even guided by procedure, could not always match reality. A lesser-known fact is that no procedural system can fully eliminate risk, only redistribute and reduce it, often shifting it toward less predictable scenarios. The cost to workers became more visible over time. Long-term exposure to night shift conditions affected not just sleep, but metabolism, mood, and cognitive function. Some workers adapted, others cycled out. A lesser-known fact is that studies have linked extended night shift work to increased risks of certain chronic conditions, though estimates vary depending on duration and individual factors. There was also a social cost. Night workers operated out of sync with the rest of society. Their routines did not align with daylight schedules, which affected relationships, communication, and daily life. A lesser-known fact is that social isolation has been identified as a contributing factor to turnover in night shift roles. Independent of job difficulty, inside the system, a quiet hierarchy developed. Experienced workers learned to navigate the rules with precision, understanding not just what to do, but when strict adherence mattered most. New workers relied more heavily on the written instructions, sometimes without context. A lesser-known fact is that mentorship and formal guidance from experienced workers has been shown to improve compliance and reduce errors more effectively than additional written rules. The beginning of transformation came not from failure, but from success. As incidents decreased, questions emerged about efficiency. Could the same level of safety be maintained with fewer steps, fewer checks, less redundancy? The answer was not simple. A lesser-known fact is that attempts to streamline procedures often led to temporary increases in error rates as workers adjusted to new systems. Technology accelerated the change. Sensors became capable of continuous monitoring. Cameras could detect movement patterns. Algorithms could flag anomalies based on data trends rather than human observation. the role of the human shifted again from observer to interpreter. A lesser-known fact is that predictive maintenance systems can identify potential failures hours or even days before they become visible to human operators. But this introduced a new kind of uncertainty. Workers had to trust systems they could not fully see or understand. When an alert appeared, it came with data, not explanation. The rules adapted, verify, confirm, act. A lesser-known fact is that trust in automated systems is highly sensitive to false alarms too. Many incorrect alerts can reduce compliance with real ones. Training evolved alongside this shift. Instead of memorizing procedures, workers were trained to understand systems, to recognize patterns, to respond to exceptions. Simulation became a key tool, allowing rare scenarios to be practiced without real risk. A lesser-known fact is that simulation-based training significantly improves response times in emergency situations, even when those situations are rarely encountered in real life. Despite these advancements, the core tension remained: human limitation versus system demand. No amount of technology could fully remove the need for human judgment, especially in unpredictable situations. The rules continued to exist, but they changed form, less rigid, more adaptive, but still present. In its later years, the system became less visible but more pervasive. It was embedded in software, in interface design, in automated prompts and confirmations. Workers might not see a list of rules, but they followed them through guided actions and system constraints. A lesser-known fact is that modern user interface design often incorporates error-proofing features that prevent incorrect actions before they occur, a concept derived from earlier procedural systems. The legacy spread beyond industry. Healthcare adopted similar approaches, using checklists and protocols to reduce errors in high-stress environments. Aviation refined them into precise, practiced sequences. Even everyday technology's navigation systems, safety alerts, confirmation prompts reflect the same principles. A lesser-known fact is that the concept of fail-safe design has roots in industrial safety systems developed to manage human error. What remains constant is the recognition of a simple truth: under certain conditions, people will make mistakes. The system was never about eliminating that truth, but about working with it. And somewhere, during a quiet stretch of night, a worker still pauses before acting, not because they feel uncertain, but because a rule written long ago for a reason they may never know tells them to stop, to check, to confirm. Nothing happens, and that is still the point.